A double life is rarely a sequence of casual, disorganized lies. Sustaining two mutually exclusive identities requires a massive, resource-heavy psychological architecture. It is a biological engine built on a violent partition of the self. Cognitive psychology maps this framework through the theory of structural dissociation of the personality. When severe developmental trauma occurs, the brain often fails to integrate different ego states into a single, cohesive identity. To navigate daily life, the brain builds an apparently normal part. This persona is strictly engineered for social survival, maintaining relationships, fulfilling professional duties, and exhibiting complete avoidance of any traumatic memory or socially unacceptable behavior. Simultaneously, the brain isolates an emotional part. This acts as a containment vessel. It holds the intense, suppressed desires, unresolved trauma, and high arousal thrill-seeking behaviors that would completely destroy the stability of the normal persona. You cannot harbor two conflicting realities in one mind without generating immense cognitive friction. Preventing immediate psychological collapse requires a highly organized neurobiological system. The brain has to actively manage the borders between these two parts of the self. This model visualizes the 8-phase deception loop. It operates as a closed economy, balancing safe attachment against a trauma-driven compulsion for risk. This loop runs on a measurable metabolic budget. The brain heavily recruits neural pathways to continually fund the barriers dividing these identities. Over time, the physiological stress of running this system accumulates a massive allostatic load. The math guarantees a systemic rupture, where the deception collapses under its own weight, unless it is violently interrupted by an overwhelming biological shift, such as pregnancy. Deception of this magnitude is a metabolic tax. Survival in a double life relies entirely on the physical capacity of the brain to continually finance its own dissociation. Node 1 in this diagram represents relational anchoring. Here, the normal persona secures a primary, socially acceptable attachment. By engaging in extreme idealization, the hypothalamus releases surges of oxytocin and vasopressin. These bonding hormones chemically reduce the brain's perception of social threat. The result is a rigid home self schema. It creates a stable, highly organized base of operations. With the primary relationship secured, Node 2 triggers shadow emergence. The individual begins testing secondary, conflicting desires outside the safety of the anchor relationship. To prevent the intense discomfort of cognitive dissonance, the brain deploys compartmentalization. This is an unconscious defense mechanism that segregates conflicting behaviors into entirely isolated mental boxes. Central to this phase is the isolation of affect. The brain mechanically detaches the emotional consequence of an action from the memory of the event itself. By stripping the emotion from the action, the suppressed emotional part of the self can execute deceptive acts without triggering immediate guilt or behavioral correction from the normal functioning persona. Compartmentalization builds the foundational structural barrier. It ensures the shadow behavior can begin without immediately contaminating the anchor relationship. Note 3 illustrates the bifurcation of reality. The two personas are now actively managing separate daily schedules, separate finances, and separate relationships. As a result, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex flares into activity. Keeping those worlds separate carries a steep neurobiological cost. Chronic compartmentalization forces the ventromedial prefrontal cortex into continuous suppression mode, steadily increasing the brain's baseline cognitive load. The mind relies on self-state dependent memory. Information gathered by the secret persona becomes biologically difficult to access when the normal persona takes control, facilitating the illusion of consistency. At Node 4, the growing gap between the individual's actions and their core values threatens to shatter the dissociative barrier. The brain must engage in aggressive moral reframing to justify the behavior. Cognitive science explains this through the Bayesian brain model. The brain acts as a prediction engine, constantly refining its internal model of reality to minimize surprises or prediction errors. When an individual lies successfully, the brain creates an error code that updates its model. It integrates observable facts with the deceptive bias. The lie becomes automated, and the individual biologically feels truthful even while actively deceiving. Successful dissonance management eliminates immediate mental friction, but it drastically accelerates the hidden, cumulative metabolic debt required to keep the system running. Look at Node 5, threshold escalation. Every successful evasion of detection triggers the brain's ventral striatum. Secrecy creates a closed behavioral addiction loop fueled by acute dopamine spikes. Like any dopaminergic cycle, the brain develops tolerance. The individual requires increasingly higher risks and more elaborate deceptions to achieve the same chemical high. This escalation drives the cycle straight into Node 6, systemic rupture. The cognitive load of managing the expanding web of lies becomes mathematically unsustainable. The failure point is called allostatic overload. The cumulative stress of the deception finally exceeds the prefrontal cortex's physical capacity to maintain suppression. The dissociative barriers collapse. The emotional, secret self rapidly bleeds into the normal social self. The biological response is severe. The amygdala and the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis activate in defense, triggering acute somatic stress symptoms. Nausea, triggers, and severe panic set in as the neural masks fail. Panicked by exposure, the brain triggers phase 7, ego defense. The individual utilizes strategic disclosure, confessing only to minor, manageable lies to pacify observers, while desperately trying to keep the core shadow self hidden. The exposure of a double life is rarely the result of a careless mistake. It is the mathematical certainty of biological resource depletion. This brings us to phase 8, the maternal reset. Look at this comparison. Pregnancy provides a massive biological and psychological pivot point. The physical demands of gestation force an immediate exit from the deception loop. The transition to motherhood is called matrescence. It features profound hormonal surges in oxytocin and progesterone that chemically decrease risk tolerance and force the brain to prioritize the safety of primary attachments. The brain physically restructures itself. Scans reveal a 5% loss of gray matter volume during pregnancy. The brain intentionally streamlines its architecture to focus entirely on social cognition and infant care. This massive neural pruning effectively starves out the complex, energy-intensive deceptive pathways. The secondary self loses its biological funding. Evolutionary psychology dictates that the sex with the highest obligatory parental investment becomes highly risk-averse. Pregnancy forces a brutal recalibration of mate strategy. The drive for short-term novelty vanishes, replaced by a mandate for long-term desertion protection. Energy allocation totally shifts. The brain transitions away from managing psychosocial stress and routes all available resources toward biological survival and gestation. Matrescence forces a hard biological override. The extreme metabolic cost of growing a human life makes the cognitive cost of deception instantly unaffordable. This creates a critical debate. Does the maternal transition permanently delete the loop, or simply lock the gears in place and suspend its rotation? The reset argument posits that biological pruning and the profound emergence of a maternal identity successfully overwrite the previous dissociative structures. The individual sheds the deceptive persona entirely. Conversely, the amplification argument notes that the immense stress and documented cognitive decline of early motherhood provide perfect cover. The sheer exhaustion of parenting offers a smokescreen for further compartmentalization. The dialectical synthesis suggests that the brain undergoes a temporary functional reorganization. It alters its priorities to survive the immediate physical stress of pregnancy, but it does not enact permanent structural healing. The maternal reset acts as an evolutionary survival tactic. It buys the organism time to stabilize, but it does not inherently process or resolve the core trauma driving the dissociation. Zooming out to view the entire architecture, the 8-phase loop operates as a highly functional pressure release valve. It allows a fragmented personality to survive unintegrated trauma. The pivot into motherhood drastically alters the cost-benefit analysis of risk. It biologically compels the individual to take the exit ramp, forcing a return to relational anchoring, often with a renewed commitment to the primary partner. But the long-term risk remains completely dormant. Once the heavy biological burden of early motherhood subsides, the cognitive resources required to sustain compartmentalization eventually free up again. Unless the structural dissociation between the normal and emotional selves is clinically integrated, the engine remains on standby, ready to restart. The fault lines remain. A double life is never a truly sustainable state. It is a profound metabolic tax levied on a brain desperately trying to survive the friction of its own fragmented reality.